industry, not enough oversight, not enough regulation, too much complexity. At the same time, when they talk about solutions, they're calling for resurrecting the failed World Trade Organization talks that collapsed this summer. And we heard, if you recall, this summer when the Doha talks collapsed, that globalization and the Washington consensus were dead because developing countries had rejected it. The other thing that they're calling for is a greater role for the International Monetary Fund. Now, it's important to understand that the reason why the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization and the whole free trade agenda generally has been in collapse in recent years is because countries around the world are no longer willing to accept the conditions attached to joining this club, the conditions attached to an International Monetary Fund loan. In reasserting a greater role for the International Monetary Fund, in calling for the World Trade Organization talks to get back on track, these world leaders are actually calling for more financial market deregulation, more of the same. I'll give you one example. The Doha talks, although much of the focus has been on agricultural subsidies, part of the Doha talks is about financial sector deregulation and the push, particularly from Britain and the United States, for countries like China and India to open up their financial services markets to U.S. and British and European companies who want into these markets. What's really striking is that you hear this language of anti-protectionism, that we can't turn away from free trade. What this really means, Amy, is that Citibank and Barclays want to go into China, want to go into India, and they want to buy up Chinese and Indian banks. They want to get it into these markets. But what's so incredible in this moment is the hypocrisy, just the rampant hypocrisy, because Barclays and Citibank and all of the other banks that would benefit from this type of free trade are, of course, the very banks that are receiving massive state protection from their own governments in the form of the bailouts that we've just been discussing. So these sort of corporate welfare bums now want to use the language of anti-protectionism to go into other countries and buy up their assets. But of course, they're being subsidized so heavily by their own taxpayers. So it's a moment of high hypocrisy. It's also a moment of, as I said at the beginning, lost opportunities, because just to give you one example, think about what these leaders could do if they really wanted to in terms of collaborating to harmonize regulation so that banks were no longer able to pit governments against each other for who could offer the lowest taxes, who could give them the best tax havens, who could offer the lowest regulation. There was just a hearing on Friday about hedge funds that Henry Waxman convened, and before those hearings, we heard from one of the wealthiest hedge fund owners in the country, Ken Griffin, who's actually an Obama supporter. Ken Griffin, a billionaire hedge fund owner, he owns Citadel Investment, was asked by the committee whether he believed that hedge funds were sufficiently regulated and whether they should be more highly taxed. What Ken Griffin said was that if that happened, there would be even more jobs in the financial industry in the United States lost to Britain. And he talked about how his heart breaks when he goes to Canary Wharf in London and sees how many good jobs have been lost to Britain, which has, in many ways, less regulation of hedge funds. Well, what's so striking about that, Amy, is that it would be so easy in this moment for the U.S. government and the British government to actually harmonize their regulations so that companies like Citadel Investment and other hedge funds would really have nowhere to run. And when you have a crisis like this, which so clearly shows the need for those types of regulations, when you have an election like there just was in the United States, where people have said clearly that this is a priority, the leaders have an opportunity to act and to close down these tax havens, to prevent this ability of governments to be pitted against one another and have a race to the top as opposed to a race to the bottom. But they blew that opportunity, and they actually called for less regulation.
Just underscoring what you wrote on the whole issue of the difference in the bailouts, the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown extracting meaningful guarantees for taxpayers, voting rights on banks, seats on their boards, 12% in annual dividend payments to the government, a suspension of dividend payments to shareholders, restrictions on executive bonuses, a legal requirement banks lend money to homeowners and small businesses. Here in the United States, Washington Post reporting major U.S. banks are on pace to spend more than half their bailout money on rewarding their shareholders. The 33 banks are set to receive some $163 billion in government bailouts. Half of that sum will go to paying off shareholders over the next 3 years.
Yeah, this bailout is really not a bailout at all. It's a parting gift to the people that that George Bush once referred to jokingly as my base. You know, in one of my columns recently, I likened it to what European colonial rulers used to do when they finally realized they had to hand over power. They would loot the treasury on the way out the door. The reason why there has been this dramatic change in policy just in recent days, where Henry Paulson has said, okay, well, we're not going to do what we originally said at all, which is use the bailout money to buy distressed assets, to buy bad debts. Now we're going to go from these equity deals with the banks to bailing out credit card companies. The reason for that is that first $250 billion was essentially money down the drain. And they are admitting that it didn't do what it was supposed to do, which was increase lending. So now they're making it up as they go along. It's take 3, take 4, take 5, but we're supposed to somehow not notice that that $250 billion, an astronomical sum, was just wasted going to bonuses, going to shareholder payouts, going to CEO salaries, and now they're trying another method to get lending going. But it really was the parting gift, Amy. And if we think about what this money means, and this is, you know, this crisis isn't over, and the same people who justified this bailout, who clamored for this bailout, are the very people who are going to turn around and say to Barack Obama, we can't afford for you to make good on your election promises. We can't afford universal health care. In fact, we can't afford what meager services Americans get in exchange for their tax dollars, like Social Security payments. We're already hearing this lowering of expectations now in the national discourse. So the money, this really is, you know, reverse Robin Hood gone mad. The money has been given to the people who need it at least, and it's going to be used to justify austerity measures imposed against those who need it most. It's going to be used to justify cuts to food stamps. It's going to be used to justify cuts to Social Security, to health care, let alone being used to justify why more ambitious plans for a national health care program for green energy are not affordable. So people have to be ready for this. You know, the next shock is yet to come.
Your final thought, this on the bailing out of the auto industry, the big 3 in Detroit, starting with General Motors?
Well, obviously, it shouldn't be a blank check. You know, I always think about what the International Monetary Fund does when developing countries come and ask for a loan. Think about what they're doing right now. The International Monetary Fund says, you want a loan? Well, here's our list of conditions. They used to call it structural adjustment. The same thing could be done to the auto industry. If they're coming for a bailout, they should be structurally adjusted, and taxpayers should be paying IMF to the auto industry and insisting that they change the way they work, that they build green automobiles, that they protect jobs, and it can't simply be a blank check. That said, what's really disturbing is the way the Bush administration appears to be using the desire among Democrats to bail out the auto industry to horse trade the free trade deal with Colombia. You know, what we're really seeing, Amy, is a resurrection of the entire free trade, discredited free trade agenda. This crisis being used, the shock of this crisis being used to resurrect all of these discredited deals, the Colombia free trade deal, the International Monetary Fund, the Doha round. They're all coming back from the dead at precisely the moment that we should be actually burying for good this whole agenda of deregulation.
Naomi Klein, I want to thank you for being with us, award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, author of the bestseller, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Her latest piece is in The Nation. It's called In Praise of Iraqi Transition. Before that, in Rolling Stone magazine, and that's called The Bailout Profiteers. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Naomi was speaking to us from the CBC TV studios in Toronto. When we come back, we look at the transition team around intelligence. Who has President-elect Obama chosen? What do they represent? Stay with us.